Hey, it's Broken Office Chair, a podcast produced by Alternatives. Broken Office Chair is hosted by Alternatives Executive Director Bessie Alcantara. Bessie is a Chicago native, first-generation Salvadoran Mexican-American who's passionate about dismantling systemic racism. In each episode, Bessie will be joined by her friends and colleagues who are ready to speak candidly about their experiences as people of color in their various professions. In the episodes, they'll address topics such as issues in the nonprofit sector, racial equity, DEI in practice, and much, much more.
Today, I am joined by Tawa Mitchell, Senior Program Officer at MacArthur Foundation. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So, we are here on a very interesting day. This is going to air later. So, for context, today is November 6th. And we were just sitting here processing a little bit before we got started.
Mm-hmm.
But before we jump into what this means, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got into this work and what it means to you? Because I think that will segue us into what we're dealing with today.
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you again for having me. I am a native Chicagoan, born and raised on the south side of Chicago in South Shore. Shout out to South Shore, the east side. And I went to Chicago public schools. My Chicago-ness is very important to me. And I think one of the things that's equally important to me is my family, my upbringing, and my very rootedness in all things African and all things Black people. And so my parents are, I think in today's society, would be considered Black nationalists, but they sent me to a private, independent, African-centered school as a child. It was New Concept Development Center. Now it's New Concept School, and has evolved into what we now know as the Betty Shabazz Charter School. But from a very, very young age, even before that, I went to something called Ile Iwe Omanara, like an African-centered nursery school.
Oh, interesting.
And I think my mother, very specifically my mother, just so you know, my whole life story, my name, Tawa Kalitu Moromo K. Joganasimi, is Nigerian because my biological father is Nigerian. And my parents divorced when I was 2. And so my mom, for a period of time before she married my stepfather, who raised me, was a single mother. And so she made very tough decisions early on. One, to divorce my father for my own safety and for hers. And 2, to really ground me in specific values that were important to her. And I think those decisions really helped me contextualize an election like today. I turned 50 on my last birthday. And
do not look 50.
Thank you.
At all.
And I think for the past 50 years, knowing who I am and whose I am help to ground me in my work and help me make sense and meaning of the world around me. And so now I'm a mother of a 2-year-old. And so all of those things, those thoughts, my upbringing, being proud of who I am, being proud of my culture, understanding that my work is not just for me and my family's livelihood, but for the community from whence I come and for those who will come after me, both in the field of philanthropy and also in the community that I hope to serve. And so all of those things are sort of what ground me and what brought me to philanthropy. The love of humanity is what the profession and the word is supposed to mean. But on a professional level, I came to this work from Kenwood Academy, then Spelman College, then the University of Chicago, what is now the Crown Family School at the University of Chicago for my graduate work. And in between college and my graduate studies, I was a member of the AmeriCorps Vista program, and I did that service here in Chicago for a now defunct nonprofit called the Chicago Alliance for Neighborhood Safety. And the organization was a nonprofit organization that had a downtown office, but it was really a coalition of community-based organizations, many of whom are still around today, like Logan Square Neighborhood Association and others, that really came together to organize in Chicago to help bring community policing as a practice to the city. And those organizations in that coalition really was responsible for bringing what we now know to be the Chicago Alternative Policing Strategy, or CAPS, to the city. And the premise was that neighbors were empowered to problem solve issues of crime and disorder in their own neighborhood, and that they could organize around the things that were important to them and therefore create safer communities. And that work was undergirded by the organization where I sat, CANS, and they provided the policy framework and some of the evidence base for bringing community policing. This was in the mid to late 90s. And ultimately, they were successful in winning this campaign and bringing community policing at scale to the city. But they eventually worked themselves out of a job. That is to say that the city of Chicago at the time had a joint community policing training contract, and this community-based organizations and the nonprofits worked alongside the city and the Chicago Police Department to really implement this method beat by beat in communities all across Chicago. And then ultimately the city said, you know what, we can do this on our own and we don't really need a contract. And some of the lead practitioners who had been doing that work on the CBO side came to work for the Chicago Police Department and the city. And ultimately, CANS did not have like a plan B for how it would sustain itself as a nonprofit. And we know that in 2024, like issues of crime and disorder in neighborhoods across Chicago has, you know, that problem has not been solved. And we also know that it's important for communities to be active participants in the neighborhoods that they want to see, and we have a rich history of that in this city. But I learned a lot of lessons there as an AmeriCorps member, as a VISTA, around, which is an acronym for Volunteers in Service to America, not only about community organizing. I was trained by some of the best, not only about the importance of community-based organizations and helping residents see their own power and bringing issues to bear, but also about organizational efficiency and what it takes to keep a nonprofit going, how you can't be overly reliant on one particular funding stream, and then the challenges inherent in all of that sort of happening at one time. And there were some brilliant leaders of that organization that I was privileged to work with and learn from. And to see that organization sort of slowly die on the vine was what was the seed that was planted in me about what I wanted to do with my own career. I wasn't quite in my mind knowing that I wanted to go into philanthropy, but I did know that I wanted to go into a field that was interested in nonprofit management, that was interested in social sector issues, how systems work together. And so that's how I ended up applying to what was then the School of Social Service Administration, and ultimately matriculating there. And I mean, I'm a now a Crown family proud alumni or alumna of the organization of the school, but I'm because of the training that it provided, but because of the way that it helped to amplify these issues. And I can say many things about Spelman College as well, which also has my heart. But in terms of my career path to philanthropy, I then, upon graduating from SSA, came to Chicago Public Schools, as it were, in October of 2001, when Arne Duncan had just recently become the CEO of Chicago Public Schools. And I had the privilege of working there for 6 years in various capacities. And it was there, I was in 2 offices that were brand new under his administration's leadership. One was a unit of the CEO's office that was concerned with strategic planning and helped to create the blueprint for what became the first 5 years of his administration, meeting with various stakeholders, anybody that you can think of. We ran focus groups of parents and teachers, administrators, researchers, philanthropists, et cetera, to help create and sort of unearth what the priorities for Chicago Public Schools should be at the time. And that was a fascinating experience, having been the daughter of a Chicago Public School educator and a dad who was a college professor, but both of them together working on curriculum that the Chicago Public Schools and other teachers benefited from. And just growing up and hearing stories about CPS at the dinner table and sort of the challenges that they came across as professional development providers in the system, and being a product of Chicago Public Schools myself, and then trying to make sense of all of that and all of these conversations and sort of bringing my full self to bear in that role. But one of the hallmarks of that plan was creating schools as centers of community, and really trying to create what ultimately became the goal of creating 100 community schools in the Chicago public school system. And these are schools that essentially were designed to recognize the fact that education was changing, and that to educate a child, you had to educate the whole child. And that included parents and families, and offering certain services that may be beyond education, like what we think of as reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also mental health services, behavioral, clinical, physical health services, parent education, English as a second language, trying to ensure that the needs of the students were met, vision and hearing and all kinds of things, after school, snacks. But it was a philosophy around, if we want children to be successful, their families have to be successful. We have to extend the school day, and we need to provide these services to ensure their success. And so in those 2 roles, the strategic planning unit of the CEO's office, and then ultimately the Office of After School and Community School Programs, philanthropy was essential to getting anything done, because Arne at the time had excellent ideas. So did his chief education officer at the time, who was Dr. Barbara Eason-Watkins. And to implement those ideas and to test these things required the support and investment of philanthropy, because, and I now know, like, viscerally, that is our job, or what we see as our job, to seed ideas, to test them, to try to help develop an evidence base for a theory of change. And then once that point has been proven, to hopefully have that taken up by government and other entities who can scale it and make them so. And there are many examples, not only in our city, but obviously throughout our nation, where this has worked really well. And there are some things that have not worked as well. But, you know, that's our job. And that ultimately led to a 13-year career in various roles in city government, largely around education, policy, and programs, and ultimately leading me to MacArthur to work on education issues And then we exited our education program shortly after I started, which was also a lesson in and of itself. But the Chicago team was created during the time of transition at the foundation, where we sort of rethought the way that we do our grant making writ large. And now we have a frame of big bets and enduring commitments. And I work on, I feel like I've been talking a lot all this whole time, but essentially the Chicago commitment team where I work is an enduring commitment. And as a native Chicagoan, it is a joy to work on the issues I get to work with, and bringing it back to the day after the election. I'm so happy that I work at the MacArthur Foundation at this time. And as it happened, we had a scheduled meeting that was called the State of the Foundation. That was an all-staff meeting as our president, John Palfrey, looks ahead to his second term as president. He joined us in 2019. And it was sort of a happy coincidence circumstance that this sort of fireside chat and State of the Foundation for internal staff was scheduled this morning because it offered us a time to connect, to remind ourselves like what we were about as a foundation, our core values. I think the three pillars of John's administration, and just like keeping our eyes on the prize. Like if we truly want to create a more just, verdant, and peaceful world, like how do we do that? And why are our core values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and empathy, and learning, and all of the things, like why are they important now? And why we can't take our eyes off of our own mission and our own big bets and enduring commitments. Like I can say more about what we invest in, but it all adds up to that, right? And the kind of world we want to see, and the kind of people we want to be, and how we want to lead and do our own work and in partnership with others. So anyway, I'm grateful that was the space that I got to reflect in, because I was in a very dark place. And I'm not to say that I'm not, as a person, I am deeply disappointed in the nation that I call home and my fellow Americans.
He won the popular vote this time.
Yeah. And knowingly, like people went and cast their vote, as is their right, for a leader that I would say personally does not have my best interests at heart, or the best interests of the people that I care deeply about. But that is Tawa's opinion. And I don't, I don't purport to speak for John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur in this with that statement. But I do think that wearing my hat as a grant maker and as a program officer on our Chicago team, which invests in people, places, and partnerships to advance racial equity, right? And to ensure equitable outcomes for all Chicagoans. What we anticipate in a presidency of President-elect Donald Trump, in some of the stated policies of the campaign, in some of the staff people who have come out and talked about mass deportation, for example, on day one, and other terrifying agenda items that are a priority of the new administration. They are counter to what our stated goals are on our team. And so that is the context, for example, One of the areas of work that I am proud to lead on our team is something called civic partnerships, where we work in collaboration with other foundations and philanthropies on issues that are timely and pressing for Chicago and for our region. And in that capacity, we have invested in a myriad of things around COVID relief and recovery, following the 2020 dual crisis of the racial reckoning brought about by the murder of George Floyd, as well as the things that we were doing to try to advance like a public health infrastructure for our city. We've invested in trying to enable community-based organizations with our partners at Forefront and many other funders around the table to ensure an accurate and fair census count in the last census. But the lion's share of our resources in this particular area, civic partnerships, go towards reducing gun violence and improving community safety in Chicago and neighborhoods who are the top neighborhoods that are deeply affected by gun violence. And we do that through something called the Partnership for Safe and Peaceful Communities, which ironically, in 1998, if you had told me in 2024 that that's an issue that I would be working on, I would laugh because I had no idea that it would just come full circle like that for me. But, we know now more about what drives violence, in addition to the acute sort of conflicts that result in a shooting or a homicide death. We also know more about the historic disinvestment that has led us to this point, that has created communities, conditions in communities that have led us here. And so in the previous Biden-Harris administration, a lot of federal dollars have been unlocked for cities facing this crisis across America. The hardest hit cities by gun violence, that have really elevated the value of community violence intervention approaches, about investing in community infrastructure, working alongside law enforcement to help us tamp down violence. And we have emerging evidence from our research partners to say that these kinds of strategies are working. A lot of those federal dollars were from the American Recovery Act, or ARPA, and those monies are coming to an end. But we can anticipate in a Trump presidency that when those monies do end, we don't anticipate, let's say, federal dollars going to cities like Chicago, like St. Louis, like others that are very much affected by the landscape that I just described to you. And one has to hold two things at once, right? Like, we can invest in credible law enforcement that works alongside the communities that it serves, that helps us advance a more just policing approach, and alternatives to policing to help keep people safe, and first response and others. And we can invest in community violence interrupters and credible messengers that work alongside law enforcement with their professional understanding to help keep communities safe. And if we have emerging evidence about these things working well in places, why wouldn't we continue to invest in them at every level of government? But we don't anticipate, based on the tea leaves now, that kind of co-investment will continue. I think,
here's the thing, we're not coming in blind into this period, right? Because it's a second term, right? And so we have the lessons of the first term to be able to look to and say, this is how that was handled. And some executive orders that were passed during his term that may have not been enforced under the Biden-Harris administration, but can be enforced now. And I think one of the things obviously we're all focused on the federal elections from the presidential election specifically. But I think one of the things that's really interesting to me right now, and particularly concerning that is different from 2016, is that this time the Supreme Court is red and the House. And so all three branches of our government are actually aligned in policies and ideals and what they feel the approach should be. And we can look to what is happening in places like Florida and Texas and Arizona to understand where that party sits in terms of policies. So when we talk about the values are not aligned with mine, we're seeing it in practice, right? And I can speak, for alternatives, they're not aligned with alternatives. Like, we have values that are around equity and liberation. And we can't say that policies that deny women care because it might be perceived as an abortion and women are dying because of these policies. That is not equity, right?
Of course.
Policies that are eliminating critical race theory from curriculums, and
the whole bastardization of what critical race theory is,
yes,
and what it is not,
right?
I mean, basically, we just want to amplify the truth and put things into historical perspective so that everyone is starting from the same place.
And if your feelings are hurt in the process, go to therapy.
I mean,
because that is what actually happened, right? And we were talking about the conversation before you and I got started, the conversation about withholding money from sanctuary cities and what that means, and how we're going to be impacted by that. But also, there's I've talked about this a lot recently. One of the executive orders that he passed right before he left office last time was around anybody receiving any sort of government funding could not talk about the topics that were sensitive around race. And I don't remember how exactly it was worded, but it was worded around the way that you can't make one group feel guilty over, and they were in the process of setting up a hotline for employees to report employers for talking about these issues. And so the question at Alternatives that we've been asking around impact is like, what is the line, right? Like, how do we stay true to these values? And also, what good is it to stand true to these values if we have to lay off 100 people because somebody reported us and now we can't get any more government funding? And so, like, the impact of this, and what does that mean, right? So Alternatives ceases to exist. We serve over 5,000 young people every year in our behavioral health services and restorative justice services, which goes to the violence de-escalation that you're talking about, right? And mental health is a huge need post-pandemic.
Absolutely.
And in communities of color, huge needs prior to the pandemic. And then that's not even including the number of the adults that we train around these particular issues. We have an entire capacity building arm that's rooted in an equity lens. We also run a fellowship to train nonprofit management professionals. You talked a little bit about what it takes to sustain a nonprofit, right? And those are all leaders of color. So we don't talk about this without talking about being a person of color. And so one of the questions I also have right now is like, how do we pivot our curriculum to address the reality that we're not working going forward with the resources we were working with before? And we're going to be working with so many more challenges and so many more barriers because we don't know what policies are going to be enforced and what new ones are going to be coming down the pipeline with his knowledge that now he has the legislative branch and the Supreme Court as well.
Yes. And, all I can say is that we have to be focused on the North Star. And that goes for MacArthur. That goes for Alternatives. Yes, this is perhaps not the ideal electoral outcome that we wanted for all of the reasons. And we are a nonpartisan organization, too. But so I say this in the context of, what approaches are we supporting when we think about our philanthropic theories of change, right? And the best outcome to help ensure that we get those things, that our grantees' work is supported and we can advance our priorities that get us closer to the things that we care about and our varying theories of change across the foundation. And all we can do is sort of what we can do. And like, we control our actions and our thoughts, which was reminder number one, and that we can stay focused on the work that we have ahead of us, which was like point number two. And so I feel like that is applicable across what we're talking about. And that can still mean like mobilizing the people that we serve. We're not, obviously, we can each ensure that we can advocate on behalf of the constituents we serve, whether that's the clients at alternatives or grantees that we support, and continuing to shine a light on the issues that we're trying to solve, because sometimes we operate from an assumption that people should just know better, but they don't. In some cases, they don't know why these issues matter, how the things that they may be concerned about, the economy, for example, are impacted also by the conditions that we're describing and that we're trying to improve for all people. So, I think we just continue to work and continue to educate and continue to focus on those things that are at the core and the heart, the mission, really, of our organizations, because otherwise it's crazy making. It's just, it's crazy making.
And I think you bring up another good point, which is why people voted in this direction. Because I think oftentimes we get really focused in what many of us read as the racism within this vote, right? But I think a lot of what is happening with this particular election is that people are voting because of the impact that the last few years has had on them from an economic standpoint, like cost of living, inflation, not being able to eat. Like, the reality is that it's stupidly expensive right now to survive anywhere, right? And so people, because they don't have the knowledge of how we got here, right? Because that's what's being suppressed. They're voting with that in mind. They're blaming the current administration and they're saying we need something different. So like, there is an acknowledgement within this vote that this current system is broken. The strategy on how to fix it is where we're not aligned.
And also that, and the how we got here part, I think we're also perhaps misaligned on as a country. Because and you did say that. I'm just sort of like honing in on this point as well, because some of us don't share the belief that there's not enough to go around.
I call it the myth of scarcity.
It is a myth, right? And that the only way to solve this problem, to ensure that you eat and I eat, is that we are pitted against each other in these very destructive and unhealthy ways, undergirded by these horrible narratives, right? And, even until part of me believes that that some folks voted this way because they believe this notion that people are coming here unauthorized to take what is mine or to take what is yours. And the only way to get what I am rightfully deserving of and rightfully should have for my family and for me is to cast my vote in this direction, because I have a strong belief that this will solve the problem. I heard a disturbing story on public radio where they had interviewed a gentleman who was undecided, but leaning towards the president-elect because he himself was a legal first-generation immigrant of Mexican descent, and he and his town had been helping provide translation support and other things for some new arrivals. And he was volunteering and giving of his time and like trying to help them get on their feet, even though like as part of some organization, even though he had a different path and was like, and was here legally. And in the same breath, he was talking about because of the influx of migrants in his place, he was getting routinely profiled and stopped to show driver's license and forms of identification and license and registration or whatever, because of the heightened police presence, because of the awareness of all of the influx of migrants and what an inconvenience and how, I mean, he didn't use these words, I'm saying demoralizing that was for him, right? And he thought that if they were stopped, like what I interpreted was like if that process were stopped and they could cut off the inflow of these migrants, his life would improve because people would stop like harassing him.
Which not a true statement, but
yes, correct, right? Like as opposed to interrogating the profiling and interrogating like that's not okay, right? Like we have to solve that problem. The answer, like, in other words, what am I trying to say? In my opinion, the answer is not let's stop the inflow of people seeking to improve their lives and circumstance, because again, there's enough to go around and people are often, it's been proven, doing jobs that, you know, people who are here elect often not to do, right? And instead of sort of wrestling that issue to the ground, it's sort of like the solution is like, let's stop that, as opposed to like, let's interrogate these practices and why like people are harassing me in my daily life and like what belief system and what kinds of attitudes are they holding on to that would cause that to happen in the first place? What systems are broken around surveillance and patrol and all of those things? But anyway.
But I think this goes again to the point of like this purposeful miseducation of folks, right? Because you have to understand, one, what you said and I'm not saying these in any particular order, but one is what you mentioned around what folks are doing here when they're here. They're not taking anything from you, right, as an American citizen. Two, our immigration system is completely broken. Three, even the language that we use, like I call them migrants too, but what they really are asylum seekers.
Yes,
often
absolutely.
Coming from countries that the U.S. policies disrupted and destabilized, right? But we don't also talk about that. But also there's these narratives too that go across different countries. The other one for me that comes up, I'm the daughter of immigrants. What comes up to me is the myth of the American dream. And like this idea that if you work hard enough, then you can get whatever it is that you want to achieve. So that narrative pushes this idea of individualism and that pull up bootstraps mentality that basically if you're in this situation, it's because you did it to yourself. And so like as a society in this country, we don't have a notion of collectivism. Everybody looks out for themselves and that's how they're voting. But again, that erasure of history, again, like even the acknowledgement that these borders are placed upon us, these were not borders that were here before. Everybody that's here is an immigrant to some degree or another. But policies around immigration have changed over the years.
That's right.
Unless you're Native, right? We know what we did with that population as a country. And so like there is just so many different steps that you could just point to. If folks actually knew better, then they might make different decisions. But that is what is kept from people. And because if you look from the beginning of history of time, we've always pitted folks against each other as a country, and we've always denied education because those two things allow us to perpetuate the status quo.
No arguments from me. I mean, right. So here we are. The experiment is working. I mean,
yes. And it got us to a place, and I think that's what's interesting to me, because I think there's a lesson to be learned here from how people voted and why they voted in that direction. Because if you look at the demographics already, white folks' highest vote for Trump, but then the next highest was Latinos. And I'm like, and that was a lot of our swing states right there. If you look at Florida and Arizona, for example, in particular, those are large Latino populations.
Absolutely.
And so there's something here too in terms of like not addressing. This is an ongoing. I've talked about this before, that Latinos are not just one thing. They're coming from over 30 countries in different Central South Americans, and folks haven't taken the time to understand this population specifically. But there's so much in how people voted and what the impact is going to be for us to be able to learn from. And what's also really interesting is that when we talk about our work, a lot of our work addresses the needs of both of the folks who are voting in this direction. And so, but I think my biggest fear that I keep coming back to is that it's going to be the financial constraints over the next 4 years, because I think this election shows more than ever how much our work is needed.
No arguments from me. I want to be wrong. Like, to be clear, I want to hope for a deeper interrogation of the issues that the election has sort of exposed or continues to expose. I am hopeful for more cross-pollinated dialogue, shall we say, across the aisle, and bipartisan collaboration. I want all of those things for our nation. I really, deeply do. I don't readily see the path to get there today, based on what I have been exposed to in the past, 12 to 20 hours, I guess. I'm not seeing the path today, but I believe that one exists, I believe that we can get there. And the best way, I think, to keep our vision for the America we want to see front and center is to just do our work, to just do our work. So that's how I'm going to try to sleep tonight. I didn't get much last night. Even at midnight, I just shut the television off and I was like, okay, I'm going to go to bed.
I kept checking my phone.
So that was my mistake. So then for the next 90 minutes, I did succeed in stopping all of the TV toggling and looking at the maps and listening to the pundits. It's okay, I'm done with this. I'm going to let the dog out and I'm going to go to bed. But then I spent the next 90 minutes oh my God, on my phone. And then I was okay, you know what? I believe in miracles and I'm just going to go to sleep. And as soon as my husband moved to get up this morning, I was is Donald Trump the president-elect of the United States? And he was yes. I was okay.
Yeah, that's the first thing I looked at this morning because I was trying to prep for my staff. And so, because when my husband last night was asking me, and he was you stop looking at it, I was this is going to impact us at work tomorrow. So I need to get myself in the same headspace, in the right headspace, because what a lot of folks don't think about sometimes is that when you're in leadership, you you don't show up and dump your feelings on everybody else, right? And I think that like over the next couple of days, encourage folks to take the break that they need.
Yeah.
And then just kind of go again, basically. Because I think it's really easy to want to tap out at this point.
Absolutely.
And it's, nope, that's not what we need right now.
But, you know, I don't know. I'm conflicted about this. I don't mean like we all have to hit it hard, like in the social justice movement of like, which often leads to burnout and just sort of like, you know, treading water and racing against the tide. I sort of mean like from where we sit, like just doing our like our day jobs well, right? Like just, and we both are privileged to work in a, like our day jobs are like directly contributing to the world that we want to see. So that's like a happy happenstance, I guess you could say. But I do think it's okay, like you said, if people need to rest and just let the world spin for a minute, like that's okay too, because there's enough work to go around, and some people may be energized where others are burned out. But we have to care for ourselves because,
this is work that's for the long run. It's not going to be resolved because we have to think about the next 4 years and then the cleanup after 4 years, right? And so this is a brace yourself for the long run kind of thing. So I'm going to cut us off here. Okay. We are over time.
Oh, wow. Thank you for having me. Of course, I told my life story for like 30 minutes, so I apologize for that.
Where can people find you online?
I guess they could go to my LinkedIn page. I also, they can also go to macfound.org and click on the Chicago Commitment and read about the work that we're doing.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm
glad we got a chance to chat about this.
Same.
Keep up with everything going on at Alternatives or to donate, you can visit us at our website, alternativesyouth.org. You can also follow us at Alternatives Inc. on Instagram or at Alternatives Youth on Facebook. If you want to keep up with Bessie, you can follow her on Instagram and TikTok at Bessie_Alcantara. Thanks for listening.